Lady Molly of Scotland Yard by Baroness Orczy. The End. One or two people knew that at one time Lady Molly Robertson-Kirk had been engaged to Captain Hubert de Mazareen, who was now convict number 97, undergoing a life sentence for the murder of Mr. Stedman, a solicitor of Carlisle, in the Elkhorn Woods in April 1904. Few, on the other hand, knew of the secret marriage solemnized on that never-to-be-forgotten afternoon, when all of us present in the church, with the exception of the bridegroom himself, were fully aware that proofs of guilt, deadly and irrefutable, were even then being heaped up against the man to whom Lady Molly was plighting her troth, for better or for worse, with her mental eyes wide open, her unerring intuition keen to the fact that nothing but a miracle could save the man she loved from an ignoble condemnation, perhaps from the gallows. The husband of my dear lady, the man whom she loved with all the strength of her romantic and passionate nature, was duly tried and convicted of murder. Condemned to be hanged, he was reprieved, and his sentence commuted to penal servitude for life. The question of Sir Jeremiah's estate became a complicated one, for his last will and testament was never signed, and the former one, dated 1902, bequeathed everything he possessed unconditionally to his beloved grandson Hubert. After much legal argument, which it is useless to recapitulate here, it was agreed between the parties, and ratified in court, that the deceased gentleman's vast wealth should be disposed of as if he had died intestate. One half of it, therefore, went to Captain Hubert de Mazareen, grandson, and the other half to Philip Baddock, the son. The latter bought Appledore Castle and resided there, whilst his nephew became number 97 in Dartmoor Prison. Captain Hubert had served 2 years of his sentence when he made that daring and successful escape which caused so much sensation at the time. He managed to reach Appledore, where he was discovered by Mr. Philip Baddock, who gave him food and shelter and got everything ready for the safe conveyance of his unfortunate nephew to Liverpool and thence to a port of safety in South America. You remember how he was thwarted in this laudable attempt by Lady Molly herself, who communicated with the police and gave up convict number 97 into the hands of the authorities once more. Of course, public outcry was loud against my dear lady's action. Sense of duty was all very well, so people argued, but no one could forget that at one time Captain Hubert de Mazareen and Lady Molly Robertson-Kirk had actually been engaged to be married, and it seemed positively monstrous for a woman to be so pitiless towards the man whom she must at one time have loved. You see how little people understood my dear lady's motives. Some went so far as to say that she had only contemplated marriage with Captain Hubert de Mazareen because he was then, presumably, the heir to Sir Jeremiah's fortune. Now, continued the gossips, she was equally ready to marry Mr. Philip Baddock, who at any rate was the happy possessor of one half of the deceased gentleman's wealth. Certainly Lady Molly's conduct at this time helped to foster this idea. Finding that even the chief was inclined to give her the cold shoulder, she shut up our flat in Maida Vale and took up her residence at the little house which she owned in Kirk, and from the windows of which she had a splendid view of stately Appledore Castle nestling among the trees on the hillside. I was with her, of course, and Mr. Philip Baddock was a frequent visitor at the house. There could be no doubt that he admired her greatly, and that she accepted his attentions with a fair amount of graciousness. The county fought shy of her. Her former engagement to Captain de Mazareen was well known, and her treachery to him, so it was called, was severely censured. Living almost in isolation in the village, her whole soul seemed wrapped in thoughts of how to unravel the mystery of the death of Mr. Stedman. Captain de Mazareen had sworn in his defence that the solicitor, after starting to walk through the Elkhorn Woods with him, had feared that the tramp over rough ground would be too much for him, and had almost immediately turned back in order to regain the road. But the chauffeur, George Taylor, who was busy with the broken-down car some 200 yards up the road, never saw Mr. Stedman again, whilst Captain de Mazareen arrived at the gates of Appledore Castle alone. Here he was met by Mr. Philip Baddock, who informed him that Sir Jeremiah had breathed his last an hour before. No one at the castle recollected seeing a stick in Captain Hubert's hand when he arrived, whilst there were several witnesses who swore that he carried one at Appledore Station when he started to walk with her ladyship. The stick was found close to the body of the solicitor, and the solicitor, when he met with his terrible death, had in his pocket the draft of a will which meant disinheritance to Captain de Mazareen. Here was the awful problem which Lady Molly had to face and to solve if she persisted in believing that the man whom she loved, and whom she had married at the moment when she knew that proofs of guilt were dead against him, was indeed innocent. We had spent all the morning shopping in Carlisle, and in the afternoon we called on Mr. Fuelling, of the firm of Fuelling, Steadman and Company, solicitors. Lady Molly had some business to arrange in connection with the purchase of an additional bit of land to round off her little garden at Kirk. Mr. Fuelling was courteous, but distinctly stiff in his manner towards the lady who was connected with the police, more especially when, her business being transacted, she seemed inclined to tarry for a little while in the busy solicitor's office, and to lead conversation round to the subject of the murder of Mr. Steadman. 5 years have gone by since then, said Mr. Fuelling curtly, in response to a remark from Lady Molly. I prefer not to revive unpleasant memories. You, of course, believed Captain de Mazareen guilty, retorted my dear lady imperturbably. There were circumstances, rejoined the solicitor, and, of course, I hardly knew the unfortunate young man. Messrs. Truscott and Truscott used to be the family solicitors. Yes, it seemed curious that when Sir Jeremiah wished to make his will, he should have sent for you, rather than for his accustomed lawyer, mused Lady Molly. Sir Jeremiah did not send for me, replied Mr. Fuelling, with some acerbity. He sent for my junior, Mr. Steadman. Perhaps Mr. Steadman was a personal friend of his. Not at all. Mr. Steadman was a new arrival in Carlisle, and had never seen Sir Jeremiah before the day when he was sent for, and, in a brief interview, drafted the will which, alas, proved to be the primary cause of my unfortunate young partner's death. You cannot draft a will in a brief interview, Mr. Fuelling, remarked Lady Molly lightly. Mr. Steadman did so, retorted Mr. Fuelling curtly. Though Sir Jeremiah's mind was as clear as crystal, he was very feeble, and the interview had to take place in a darkened room. That was the only time my young partner saw Sir Jeremiah. 24 hours later they were both dead. Oh, commented my dear lady with sudden indifference. Well, I won't detain you, Mr. Fuelling. Good afternoon. A few moments later, having parted from the worthy old solicitor, we were out in the street once more. The darkened room is my first ray of light, quoth Lady Molly to me, with a smile at her own paradoxical remark. When we reached home later that afternoon, we were met at the garden gate by Mr. Felkin, Mr. Philip Baddock's friend and agent, who lived with him at Appledore Castle. Mr. Felkin was a curious personality, very taciturn in manner, but a man of considerable education. He was the son of a country parson, and at the time of his father's death he had been studying for the medical profession. Finding himself unable to pursue his studies for lack of means, and being left entirely destitute, he had been forced to earn his living by taking up the less exalted calling of male nurse. It seems that he had met Mr. Philip Baddock on the Continent some years ago, and the two young men had somehow drifted into close acquaintanceship. When the late Sir Jeremiah required a personal nurse attendant, Mr. Philip Baddock sent for his friend and installed him at Appledore Castle. Here Mr. Felkin remained, even after the old gentleman's death. He was nominally called Mr. Baddock's agent, but really did very little work. He was very fond of shooting and of riding, and spent his life in the pursuit of these sports, and he always had plenty of money to spend. But everyone voted him a disagreeable bear, and the only one who ever succeeded in making him smile was Lady Molly, who always showed an unaccountable liking for the uncouth creature. Even now, when he extended a somewhat grimy hand and murmured a clumsy apology at his intrusion, she greeted him with warm effusiveness and insisted on his coming into the house. We all turned to walk along the little drive, when Mr. Baddock's car came whizzing round the corner of the road from the village. He pulled up at our gate, and the next moment had joined us in the drive. There was a very black look in his eyes, as they wandered restlessly from my dear lady's face to that of his friend. Lady Molly's little hand was even then resting on Mr. Felkin's coat-sleeve. She had been in the act of leading him herself towards the house, and did not withdraw her hand when Mr. Baddock appeared upon the scene. "Burton has called about those estimates, Felton," said the latter somewhat roughly. "He is waiting at the castle. You better take the car. I can walk home later on." "Oh, how disappointing!" exclaimed Lady Molly, with what looked uncommonly like a pout. "I was going to have such a cosy chat with Mr. Felkin, all about horses and dogs. Couldn't you see that tiresome Burton, Mr. Baddock?" she added ingenuously. I don't think that Mr. Baddock actually swore, but I am sure he was very near doing so. "Burton can wait," said Mr. Felkin curtly. "No, he cannot," retorted Philip Baddock, whose face was a frowning mirror of uncontrolled jealousy. "Take the car, Felkin, and go at once." For a moment it seemed as if Felkin would refuse to obey. The two men stood looking at each other, measuring one another's power of will and strength of passion. Hate and jealousy were clearly written in each pair of glowering eyes. Philip Baddock looked defiant, and Felkin taciturn and sulky. Close to them stood my dear lady. Her beautiful eyes literally glowed with triumph. That these two men loved her, each in his own curious, uncontrolled way, I, her friend and confidant, knew very well. I had seen and often puzzled over the feminine attacks which she had made on the susceptibilities of that morose lout Felkin. It had taken her nearly 2 years to bring him to her feet. During that time she had alternately rendered him happy with her smiles and half mad with her coquetries, whilst Philip Baddock's love for her was perpetually fanned by his ever-growing jealousy. I remember that I often thought her game a cruel one. She was one of those women whom few men could resist. If she really desired to conquer, she invariably succeeded, and her victory over Felkin seemed to me as purposeless as it was unkind. After all, she was the lawful wife of Captain de Mazareen, and to rouse hatred between two friends for the sake of her love, when that love was not hers to give, seemed unworthy of her. At this moment, when I could read deadly hatred in the faces of these two men, her cooing laugh grated unpleasantly on my ear. "Never mind, Mr. Felkin," she said, turning her luminous eyes on him. "Since you have so hard a taskmaster, you must do your duty now. But," she added, throwing a strange, defiant look at Mr. Baddock, "I shall be home this evening. Come and have our cosy chat after dinner." She gave him her hand, and he took it with a certain clumsy gallantry and raised it to his lips. I thought that Philip Baddock would strike his friend with his open hand. The veins on his temples were swollen like dark cords, and I don't think that I ever saw such an evil look in anyone's eyes before. Strangely enough, the moment Mr. Felkin's back was turned, my dear lady seemed to set herself the task of soothing the violent passions which she had wilfully aroused in the other man. She invited him to come into the house, and some 10 minutes later I heard her singing to him. When, later on, I went into the boudoir to join them at tea, she was sitting on the music stool, whilst he half bent over her, half knelt at her feet. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and his fingers were closed over hers. He did not attempt to leave her side when he saw me entering the room. In fact, he wore a triumphant air of possession, and paid her those little attentions which only an accepted lover would dare to offer. He left soon after tea, and she accompanied him to the door. She gave him her hand to kiss, and I, who stood at some little distance in the shadow, thought that he would take her in his arms, so yielding and gracious did she seem. But some look or gesture on her part must have checked him, for he turned and walked quickly down the drive. Lady Molly stood in the doorway, gazing out towards the sunset. I, in my humble mind, wondered once again what was the purport of this cruel game. Half an hour later she called to me, asked for her hat, told me to put on mine, and to come out for a stroll. As so often happened, she led the way towards the Elkhorn woods, which, in spite, or perhaps because of, the painful memories they evoked, was a very favourite walk of hers. As a rule, the wood, especially that portion of it where the unfortunate solicitor had been murdered, was deserted after sunset. The villagers declared that Mr. Steadman's ghost haunted the clearing, and that the cry of the murdered man, as he was being foully struck from behind, could be distinctly heard, echoing through the trees. Needless to say, these superstitious fancies never disturbed Lady Molly. She liked to wander over the ground where was committed that mysterious crime, which had sent to ignominy worse than death the man she loved so passionately. It seemed as if she meant to wrench its secret from the silent ground, from the leafy undergrowth, from the furtive inhabitants of the glades. The sun had gone down behind the hills. The wood was dark and still. We strolled up as far as the first clearing, where a plain granite stone, put up by Mr. Philip Baddock, marked the spot where Mr. Steadman had been murdered. We sat down on it to rest. My dear lady's mood was a silent one. I did not dare to disturb it, and for a while only the gentle hush of the leaves, stirred by the evening breeze, broke the peaceful stillness of the glade. Then we heard a murmur of voices, deep-toned and low. We could not hear the words spoken, though we both strained our ears, and presently Lady Molly arose and cautiously made her way among the trees in the direction whence the voices came, I following as closely as I could. We had not gone far when we recognized the voices, and heard the words that were said. I paused, distinctly frightened, whilst my dear lady whispered a warning "Hush." Never in all my life had I heard so much hatred, such vengeful malignity expressed in the intonation of the human voice, as I did in the half-dozen words which now struck my ear. "You will give her up, or—" It was Mr. Felkin who spoke. I recognized his raucous delivery, but I could not distinguish either of the two men in the gloom. "Or what?" queried the other, in a voice which trembled with either rage or fear, perhaps with both. "You will give her up," repeated Felkin sullenly. "I tell you that it is an impossibility, do you understand? An impossibility for me to stand by and see her wedded to you, or to any other man for the matter of that. But that is neither here nor there," he added after a slight pause. "It is with you I have to deal now. You shan't have her. You shan't. I won't allow it, even if I have to—" He paused again. I cannot describe the extraordinary effect this rough voice, coming out of the darkness, had upon my nerves. I had edged up to Lady Molly, and had succeeded in getting hold of her hand. It was like ice, and she herself was as rigid as that piece of granite on which we had been sitting. "You seem bubbling over with covert threats," interposed Philip Baddock, with what was obviously a sneer. "What are the extreme measures to which you will resort if I do not give up the lady whom I love with all my heart, and who has honoured me to-day by accepting my hand in marriage?" "That is a lie!" ejaculated Felkin. "What is a lie?" queried the other quietly. "She has not accepted you, and you know it. You are trying to keep me away from her, arrogating rights which you do not possess. Give her up, man, give her up. It will be best for you. She will listen to me. I can win her all right, but you must stand aside for me this time. Take the word of a desperate man for it, Baddock. It will be best for you to give her up." Silence reigned in the wood for a few moments, and then we heard Philip Baddock's voice again, but he seemed to speak more calmly, almost indifferently, as I thought. "Are you going now?" he asked. "Won't you come in to dinner?" "No," replied Felkin. "I don't want any dinner, and I have an appointment for afterwards." "Don't let us part ill friends, Felkin," continued Philip Baddock in conciliatory terms. "Do you know that, personally, my feeling is that no woman on earth is worth a serious quarrel between two old friends, such as we have been?" "I'm glad you think so," rejoined the other dryly. "So long." The cracking of twigs on the moss-covered ground indicated that the two men had parted and were going their several ways. With infinite caution, and holding my hand tightly in hers, my dear lady made her way along the narrow path which led us out of the wood. Once in the road we walked rapidly, and soon reached our garden gate. Lady Molly had not spoken a word during all that time, and no one knew better than I did how to respect her silence. During dinner she tried to talk of indifferent subjects, and never once alluded to the two men whom she had thus wilfully pitted one against the other. That her calm was only on the surface, however, I realized from the fact that every sound on the gravel path outside caused her to start. She was, of course, expecting the visit of Mr. Felkin. At 8 o'clock he came. It was obvious that he had spent the past hour in wandering about in the woods. He looked untidy and unkempt. My dear lady greeted him very coldly, and when he tried to kiss her hand, she withdrew it abruptly. Our drawing-room was a double one, divided by portière curtains. Lady Molly led the way into the front room, followed by Mr. Felkin. Then she drew the curtains together, leaving me standing behind them. I concluded that she wished me to stay there and to listen, conscious of the fact that Felkin, in the agitated mood in which he was, would be quite oblivious of my presence. I almost pitied the poor man, for to me, the listener, it was at once apparent that my dear lady had only bidden him come tonight in order to torture him. For about a year she had been playing with him as a cat does with a mouse, encouraging him at times with sweet words and smiles, repelling him at others with coldness not unmixed with coquetry. But tonight her coldness was unalloyed, her voice was trenchant, her attitude almost one of contempt. I missed the beginning of their conversation, for the curtains were thick, and I did not like to go too near, but soon Mr. Felkin's voice was raised. It was harsh and uncompromising. "I suppose that I am only good enough for a summer's flirtation," he said sullenly, "but not to marry, eh? The owner of Appledore Castle, the millionaire Mr. Baddock, is more in your line." "It certainly would be a more suitable match for me," rejoined Lady Molly coolly. "He told me you had formally accepted him," said the man, with enforced calm. "Is that true?" "Partly," she replied. "But you won't marry him!" The exclamation seemed to come straight from a heart brimful of passion, of love, of hate, and of revenge. The voice had the same intonation in it which had rung an hour ago in the dark Elkhorn woods. "I may do," came in quiet accents from my dear lady. "You won't marry him," repeated Felkin roughly. "Who shall prevent me?" retorted Lady Molly, with a low, sarcastic laugh. "I will." "You?" she said contemptuously. "I told him an hour ago that he must give you up. I tell you now that you shall not be Philip Baddock's wife." "Oh!" she interposed, and I could almost see the disdainful shrug of her shoulders, the flash of contempt in her expressive eyes. No doubt it maddened him to see her so cool, so indifferent, when he had thought that he would win her. I do believe that the poor wretch loved her. She was always beautiful, but never more so than tonight, when she had obviously determined finally to dismiss him. "If you marry Philip Baddock," he said now, in a voice which quivered with uncontrolled passion, "then within 6 months of your wedding day you will be a widow, for your husband will have ended his life on the gallows." "You are mad," she retorted calmly. "That is as it may be," he replied. "I warned him tonight, and he seems inclined to heed my warning, but he won't stand aside if you beckon to him. Therefore, if you love him, take my warning. I may not be able to get you, but I swear to you, Philip Baddock shan't either. I'll see him hanged first," he added, with gruesome significance. "And you think that you can force me to do your bidding by such paltry threats?" she retorted. "Paltry threats? Ask Philip Baddock if my threats are paltry. He knows full well that in my room at Appledore Castle, safe from thievish fingers, lie the proofs that he killed Alexander Steadman in the Elkhorn woods. Oh, I wouldn't help him in his nefarious deeds until he placed himself in my hands. He had to take my terms, or leave the thing alone altogether, for he could not work without me. My wants are few, and he has treated and paid me well. Now we are rivals, and I'll destroy him before I'll let him gloat over me. Do you know how we worked it? Sir Jeremiah would not disinherit his grandson. He steadily refused to make a will in Philip Baddock's favour, but when he was practically dying we sent for Alexander Steadman, a newcomer, who had never seen Sir Jeremiah before, and I impersonated the old gentleman for the occasion. Yes, I," he repeated with a coarse laugh. "I was Sir Jeremiah for the space of half an hour, and I think I played the part splendidly. I dictated the terms of a new will. Young Steadman never suspected the fraud for a single instant. We had darkened the room for the comedy, you see, and Steadman was destined by Baddock and myself never to set eyes on the real Sir Jeremiah. After the interview Baddock sent for Captain de Mazareen. This was all part of his plan and mine. We engineered it all, and we knew that Sir Jeremiah could only last a few hours. We sent for Steadman again, and I myself scattered a few dozen sharp nails along the loose stones in the road where the motor car was intended to break down, thus forcing the solicitor to walk through the woods. Captain de Mazareen's appearance on the scene at that particular moment was an unrehearsed effect, which nearly upset all our plans, for had Mr. Steadman stuck to him that night, instead of turning back, he would probably be alive now, and Baddock and I would be doing time somewhere for attempted fraud. We should have been done, at any rate. Well, you know what happened. Mr. Steadman was killed. Baddock killed him, and then ran straight back to the house, just in time to greet Captain de Mazareen, who evidently had loitered on his way. But it was I who thought of the stick, as an additional precaution to avert suspicion from ourselves. Captain de Mazareen was carrying one and left it in the hall at the castle. I cut my own hand and stained the stick with it, then polished and cleaned it up, and later, during the night, deposited it in the near neighbourhood of the murdered body. Ingenious, wasn't it? I'm a clever beggar, you see. Because I was cleverer than Baddock, he could not do without me, and because he could not do without me, I made him write and sign a request to me to help him to manufacture a bogus will, and then to murder the solicitor who had drawn it up. And I have hidden that precious document in the wing of Appledore Castle which I inhabit. The exact spot is known only to myself. Baddock has often tried to find out, but all he knows is that these things are in that particular wing of the house. I have the document, and the draft of the will taken out of Mr. Stedman's pocket, and the short bludgeon with which he was killed. It is still stained with blood, and the rags with which I cleaned the stick. I swear that I will never make use of these things against Philip Baddock unless he drives me to it. And if you make use of what I have just told you, I'll swear that I have lied. No one can find the proofs which I hold, but on the day that you marry Baddock, I'll place them in the hands of the police." There was silence in the room. I could almost hear the beating of my own heart. So horrified, so appalled was I at the horrible tale which the man had just told to my dear lady. The villainy of the whole scheme was so terrible, and at the same time so cunning, that it seemed inconceivable that human brain could have engendered it. Vaguely in my dull mind I wondered if Lady Molly would have to commit bigamy before she could wrench from this evildoer's hands the proofs which would set her own husband free from his martyrdom. What she said I did not hear, and what he meant to retort I never knew, for at that moment my attention was attracted by the sound of running footsteps on the gravel, followed by a loud knock at our front door. Instinctively I ran to open it. Our old gardener was standing there, hatless and breathless. "Appledore Castle, miss," he stammered. "It's on fire. I thought you would like to know." Before I had time to reply, I heard a loud oath uttered close to me, and the next moment Felkin dashed out of the drawing-room into the hall. "Is there a bicycle here I can take?" he shouted to the gardener. "Yes, sir," replied the old man. "My son has one, just in that shed, sir, on your left." In fewer seconds than it takes to relate, Felkin had rushed to the shed, dragged out the bicycle, mounted it, and I think that within 2 minutes of hearing the awful news, he was bowling along the road and was soon out of sight. One wing of the stately mansion was ablaze when, a quarter of an hour later, my dear lady and I arrived upon the scene. We had come on our bicycles not long after Mr. Felkin. At the very moment that the weird spectacle burst fully upon our gaze, a loud cry of horror had just risen from the 100 or so people who stood watching the terrible conflagration, whilst the local fire brigade, assisted by Mr. Baddock's men, were working with the hydrants. That cry found echo in our own throats as we saw a man clambering, with the rapidity of a monkey, up a long ladder which had been propped up against a second-floor window of the flaming portion of the building. The red glow illuminated the large, shaggy head of Felkin, throwing for a moment into bold relief his hooked nose and straggly beard. For the space of 3 seconds, perhaps, he stood thus, outlined against what looked like a glowing furnace behind him, and the next instant he had disappeared beyond the window embrasure. "This is madness!" came in loud accents from out the crowd in the foreground, and before one fully realized whence that voice had come, Mr. Philip Baddock was in his turn seen clambering up that awful ladder. A dozen pairs of hands reached him just in time to drag him back from the perilous ascent. He fought to free himself, but the firemen were determined and soon succeeded in bringing him back to level ground, whilst 2 of them, helmeted and well equipped, took his place upon the ladder. The foremost had hardly reached the level of the first story when Felkin's figure once more appeared in the window embrasure above. He was staggering like a man drunk or fainting. His shaggy hair and beard were blown about his head by the terrible draught caused by the flames, and he waved his arms over his head, giving the impression to those below, who gazed horrified, that he was either possessed or dying. In one hand he held what looked like a great long bundle. We could see him now put one leg forward, obviously gathering strength to climb the somewhat high window ledge. With a shout of encouragement, the 2 firemen scrambled up with squirrel-like agility, and the cry of "They're coming! They're coming! Hold on, Felkin!" rose from 100 excited throats. The unfortunate man made another effort. We could see his face clearly now in the almost blinding glow which surrounded him. It was distorted with fear and also with agony. He gave one raucous cry, which I do believe will echo in my ears as long as I live, and with a superhuman effort he hurled the bundle which he held out of the window. At that same time there was a terrific hissing, followed by a loud crash. The floor beneath the feet of the unfortunate man must have given way, for he disappeared suddenly in a sea of flames. The bundle which he hurled down had struck the foremost fireman on the head. He lost his hold, and as he fell, he dragged his unfortunate comrade down with him. The others ran to the rescue of their comrades. I don't think they were seriously hurt, but what happened directly after among the crowd, the firemen, or the burning building, I cannot tell you. I only know that at the moment when Felkin's figure was for the second time seen in the frame of the glowing window, Lady Molly seized my hand and dragged me forward through the crowd. Her husband's life was hanging in the balance, just as much as that of the miserable wretch who was courting a horrible death for the sake of those proofs which, as it was proved afterwards, Philip Baddock tried to destroy by such drastic means. The excitement round the ladder, the fall of the two firemen, the crashing in of the floor and the gruesome disappearance of Felkin caused so much excitement in the crowd that the bundle which the unfortunate man had thrown remained unheeded for the moment. But Philip Baddock reached the spot where it fell 30 seconds after Lady Molly did. She had already picked it up when he said harshly, "Give me that. It's mine. Felkin risked his life to save it for me." Inspector Etty, however, stood close by, and before Philip Baddock realized what Lady Molly meant to do, she had turned quickly and placed the bundle in the inspector's hands. "You know me, Etty, don't you?" she said rapidly. "Oh, yes, my lady," he replied. "Then take the utmost care of this bundle. It contains proofs of one of the most dastardly crimes ever committed in this country." No other words could have aroused the enthusiasm and caution of Etty in the same manner. After that, Philip Baddock might protest, might rage, storm, or try to bribe, but the proofs of his guilt and Captain de Mazareen's innocence were safe in the hands of the police, and bound to come to light at last. But as a matter of fact, Baddock neither stormed nor pleaded. When Lady Molly turned to him once more, he had disappeared. You know the rest, of course. It occurred too recently to be recounted. Philip Baddock was found the next morning with a bullet through his head, lying on the granite stone which, with cruel hypocrisy, he himself had erected in memory of Mr. Steadman, whom he had so foully murdered. The unfortunate Felkin had not lied when he said that the proofs which he held of Baddock's guilt were conclusive and deadly. Captain de Mazareen obtained His Majesty's gracious pardon after 5 years of martyrdom which he had borne with heroic fortitude. I was not present when Lady Molly was once more united to the man who so ardently worshipped and trusted her, and to whose love, innocence, and cause she had remained so sublimely loyal throughout the past few years. She has given up her connection with the police. The reason for it has gone with the return of her happiness, over which I, her ever faithful Mary Granard, will, with your permission, draw a veil. And the end of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard by Baroness Orczy.